I read Kiss of the Spiderwoman by Manuel Puig, and I could not have predicted how much I would love this book. Like, it's so fabulous, and I want to tell you all about it, but at the same time, I feel like when I talk about books, I spill too much of the beans and give away too much. So I'm going to be very careful in what I say about this book because if you do want to read a fabulous queer book, pick this, but also, go into it relatively blind like I did because I just think it's more enjoyable. What I will say as well is that it definitely helped that my previous read was this, because this book was so sterile and all of the intimacy fell flat. And so it made me better appreciate just how much chemistry this book has. Like, this book has chemistry to spare, and it was just so enticing. I loved it. I was like, oh, this is how you write human relationships. This is how you characterize two people with a very special bond. Like, oh, love it. I really didn't know much about this book going into it, and I was under the impression that it was two gay men that were in prison together and were slowly like forming this relationship through their shared experience. But actually, no, neither one of them are gay, really. We've got Valentin, who's in prison for like activism. He did like a protest, I think, of some sort against like the Argentine government. And he seems to be, I would say, bisexual. Like, I think he has a girlfriend on the outside, but he's not strictly into women, as we see with what happens in this book. And then we also have Molina, the other inmate, seems to be a trans woman. They never get into the topic of pronouns in the book. I think it's because, this book was written back in the 70s, where perhaps that conversation wasn't being had as much as it is now. For the sake of this review, I'll refer to Molina with she, her pronouns, because it was very clear, like, she says multiple times, I feel like a woman, like, in this relationship I have outside of prison with this man, I am the woman, like, I feel like a woman. And I just found that so ahead of its time. Like, so many people will dismiss trans arguments and say, like, oh, it's this new thing that was made up. Gender dysphoria has always been around, and I just love books like this that you can go back and read and are so, like, affirming of that. It's like, no, this has always been an issue, the way that we mistreat people who aren't born in the right body. And like, this, what a great character to learn it through. Like, had a blast. I was a bit confused though about why Molina was in prison, because it made a lot more sense why Valentin was in prison, because he was like acting against the powers that be in politics, because he's like a big libertarian reformist. But Molina, they kept saying like corruption of minors, but then I don't know, maybe I missed it where they talked about specifically what she did. I kind of interpreted it as, oh, they found this queer person and they came up with that as an excuse to put the queer person in prison, when really they just wanted her locked up for being queer. Not sure. But yes, unlike unreliable narrators, which, as I said previously, I think have been done to death, unconventional narratives, still here for. If the book is committed to delivering a format that we are not used to in your typical novel, I enjoy it. So this book, I would say, I thought it was going to be beginning to end, but it kind of tapers out at the end. All dialogue. It's just a conversation between two people. That is it. It's Valentin and Melina, just back and forth, back and forth. It also doesn't tell you who's talking at what point, so you have to rely completely on context, which can feel a bit disorienting at the start, but I think as you get into it, you appreciate why that was made as like a stylistic choice. It's clear that there's not just the physical prison, there's also like the metaphorical prison of, their sexuality, their gender identity, etc. It reminded me a lot of Misery by Stephen King, only in the way that the whole book is the conversation between two people, and there's lots of tangents that based on storytelling, because in Misery, He's like writing the book about Misery Chastain, and so there's multiple points where we see excerpts from the novel that he's writing. In this, Molina is keeping Valentin occupied because he keeps, getting bored. She keeps telling him the plots of various movies that she's watched, and that's kind of how they like while the hours away. And so even though it's quite inane and, not the most exciting thing in the world, it was still very warm and intimate and like fuzzy, and you could see them both bonding and changing their outlook on each other and on life in general, because Molina especially is very nihilistic. Like, she has time to reflect while she's in prison and appreciates that, like, outside of her relationship with her mum, she doesn't really have much of a life, which kind of informs things that happen later on. I won't say anything else than that. The only real issue I had with this book was the formatting. Whoever formatted this book, it is atrocious. Only because throughout the book there are footnotes that explore the sort of etiology of homosexuality. There's lots of psychoanalysis, there's lots of references to Freud, basically trying to get to the bottom of, why it is gay. But I liked the treatment of those footnotes. It was very absurdist. Like, in the third act, it pretty much abandons the footnotes because you can tell that the writer's arriving at the conclusion that, like, just let gay people be. Why do we need to dissect the origin of where they come from and why they're here? Like, just accept that they're not going anywhere. And fab. Love that. But the footnotes, my goodness, I guess you don't have to read the footnotes. I did, because I found them interesting. But if your footnotes are this big, you see that separation? Like, a whole third of that page and that page are taken up by a footnote. If your footnotes are that long, maybe just put them into an appendix at the back of the book. Because I like a footnote. I know some people won't read them. I typically do. Too long, way too long, especially when it's multiple sentences that carry over like a dozen pages at a time, where it feels like I now have two separate books I need to read. And I'm like, oh no, do I read the prose first or do I read the footnotes first? Oh, didn't like that. Whoever formatted this book, it's such a fabulous book. You're really doing it a disservice. Just put them at the back, As far as footnotes go, these feet are like size 12. These are some giant footnotes. How about we put them at the back so that, I can go to them and read them at my own discretion without them taking up half the page. Rant over. Seriously though, I can't recommend this enough. I need to go check out the film adaptation of this. I'm hoping that it does the book justice, because what I love as well is the whole book practically is set in a prison, but it never once entertains the very tired stereotypes about a men's prison and, the sort of promiscuity that entails, especially with like queer inmates. Like, this book doesn't have any of that, like, there's the occasional like kiss, like we build up to a kiss, but it's more romantic than that. It's about like their interpersonal connections, the way that they relate to one another. Like, it's so compassionate. None of the like physical stuff even comes into it, and I found that so refreshing, especially when you compare it to the likes of books like this, which really want to hit you over the head with the physicality of a romance, and it's just unnecessary. So yeah, if you're in the mood for an underappreciated gem, an LGBTQ plus gem, trans representation, Argentine as well, this all takes place in South America, I just think it's fabulous. Easily in my top 5 books of the year so far. Like, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and if you're anything like me, I think you will too.